ESS Ecosystems and Ecology 2, Part 4, will be the first of 2 movies on succession. This movie will define and explain the fundamental aspects of succession. The significant idea is succession leads to climax communities that may vary due to random events and interactions over time. This leads to a pattern of alternative, stable states for a given ecosystem. Here is the outline for Ecosystems and Ecology, Topic 2 in the IB ESS syllabus. Use this outline to find the part you need. This movie has its focus right here. Succession is defined as the process in which communities of plant and animal species in one area are replaced over time by a series of different communities. Succession is an orderly process of change over time in a community where one community changes the physical environment to make the environment more suitable to a second community, such that the second community outcompetes the first community, etc. The community in SEER 1, Stage 1, Phase 1, changes the habitat to benefit the community in Phase 2. The community in Phase 2 outcompetes Phase 1 and then changes the habitat to benefit the next community, Phase 3. The term SEER is synonymous with stage or phase in community succession. There are 2 broad types of succession, primary and secondary. Primary succession is succession beginning from bare rock or sand, as occurred here on the island of Surtsey, that was formed when a volcano breached the surface of the North Atlantic in 1963. Initially, there was no life, bare volcanic rock, but over time, with erosion and the arrival of various lichens and pockets of soil that will support mosses and small plants, primary succession occurred. With more time, one community gives way to another. Succession proceeds. The arrival of new species occurs by wind and animals such as birds or bats that move spores and seeds across the water. Primary succession as a term applies only to situations where succession begins where no life had previously existed, such as on an emergent volcano. Secondary succession is succession beginning from disturbance in an area that previously supported living things. So, for example, following a forest fire, or following a severe storm, or plowing of the earth by humans, secondary succession is initiated, and succession proceeds through the pioneer stage that would include mosses and grasses, such as big bluestem or Indian grass on the North American prairie. The pioneer species change the habitat. They change light availability. They alter soil composition, alter water availability, and the intermediate species arrive. The intermediate stage species arrive. Shrubs, species such as dogwood, rose, laurel, or rhododendron. The intermediate community changes the habitat further, light, soil nutrients, water, making the habitat more suitable for the next community. Then the climax community composed of trees such as pines, hickory, oak, or maples. Here are the IB syllabus statements of relevance. Define succession as the orderly process of change over time in an ecosystem where one community replaces another. Go back a few slides if you need to reinforce this definition. Secondly, you need to be able to describe the concept and processes of succession in a named habitat, and that would include named examples of organisms from the pioneer, intermediate, and climax communities. In this image, you can see succession, but it's important that you think clearly here. This is change over time in a single location. The x-axis here is time. Succession is a temporal phenomenon. Succession is a process dependent on time, change in one location in the community over time. This image of succession provides names of specific species for the pioneer, intermediate, and climax stages of succession. Study this slide. As succession proceeds in time, notice how the structural complexity of the ecosystem changes. In the climax SEER, there are more niches and a more developed decomposer community than in the pioneer SEER. As you gain experience with succession, I want you to consider how the following system parameters change. food webs, the soil community, productivity, available niches, and more. For example, consider biodiversity. In the next movie, a second, more detailed look at succession will occur. We will dig into how these system parameters change through succession. With succession, think about how the animal community is likely to change. And keep your eye on the decomposer or soil community. How about available niches, structure, community complexity? It's important that you become comfortable with described succession in a named habitat, such as temperate deciduous forest, as I've provided in this slide. There are other successional series that might interest you. Sand dune succession, known as a samosphere, or succession beginning with shallow ponds, a hydrosphere. So you need to be able to explain the general patterns of change in communities undergoing succession. So let me provide a bit more technical information on the succession process. There are 3 generalized stages in succession. There is the facilitation stage, where pioneer species change the habitat to make it suitable for other species. Consider how plants begin to shade the environment, or how plants change the organic composition of the soil. There's the inhibition phase, where species begin to interfere with each other's growth. Consider competition for light, water, nutrient resources. And then there's the tolerance phase. Late successional species tolerate each other, as well as some early successional species. Late successional species are good at competing for resources. Remember that secondary succession is succession beginning from disturbance in an area that previously supported living things. So in a sense, secondary succession is a repeating process of orderly change in communities over time in a single location that then experiences disturbance or catastrophe to return the system to a pioneer stage. Fire is an example of disturbance that would set the clock back, initiating the pioneer stage. Remember, succession is a temporal phenomenon, dependent on time. Shortly after the disturbance, grasses begin to grow. Pioneer species tend to be annuals that germinate from seed, grow to reproductive maturity, and die, all in one season, leaving numerous small seeds behind that will be ready to germinate next year. Pioneer species are opportunists. They require high insulation, high light. Pioneer species are not strong competitors, but tend to be adapted to the difficult abiotic conditions that follow disturbance. Here's a photograph of a forest 5 years after a fire, 5 years after succession processes were initiated again, following a disturbance. You can see pioneer species and the beginnings of intermediate stage species, shrubs, such as laurel and rhododendron. Here's another photograph of an intermediate stage. You can clearly see the shrubs have grown up, while the ground remains covered in pioneer species, grasses particularly. Here is a photograph of a near climax stage of succession. The climax species appear well established. However, there is a mixture of pioneer and intermediate stage species that remain on the forest floor. In the climax stage of succession, it's important to keep in mind the increased structural complexity. There are more niches and a more developed decomposer community. Here is another photograph of a climax community. Late successional species are perennials. They live long lives, and once they become reproductively mature, they flower year after year. Climax species tolerate each other, as well as some early successional species that live on the forest floor. Late successional species are good at competing for resources. With greater structural complexity, there are more niches and a more developed decomposer community. Overall, with more niches, diversity is higher, species and genetic diversity both. Alternative stable states exist in the stages of succession due to the cyclical, repeated disturbance. The nature of climax communities is influenced by the regularity of disturbance. This is a terrific slide for displaying the orderly change in communities over time through succession following disturbance, whether the disturbance be fire, people, dramatic weather, or pests, any of which could influence succession at any stage. You can see in the upper graph how one community, the mosses and grasses, would increase and then give way to a second community which would be grasses and perennials, which then give way to a third community, which gives way to a fourth, to a fifth, and so on. The diagram of the change in the upper graph is paralleled in the diagram of the lower graph. At the bottom, notice the increasing diversity through succession. Increasing diversity through succession. The climax forest has more different habitats and niches, thus there is greater species and genetic diversity. Soils develop through successional time. Particles and minerals accumulate in cracks and crevices due to weathering of the rock. Lichens assist the weathering process and add organic matter to the developing soil. In time, enough material has accumulated to support some small plants, and plants contribute more organic matter to the soil. Decomposers arrive, increasing the cycling of nutrients. Minerals, nutrients, organisms, organic matter, air, and water are all the components of soil. Over time, long periods of time, the depth of the soil thickens and it becomes more fertile. Soil is a non-renewable resource because of the time it takes to develop. Again, in this image, you can see the development of the soil over long periods of time, successional time. Soil becomes more fertile through succession, although late in succession, many of the nutrients are locked up in the tall trees of the climax stage, so nutrient cycling slows. Nevertheless, decomposers remain active late in succession, so decomposition rates are high. Here are two IB syllabus statements. Describe factors affecting the nature of climax communities. State that there is no one climax community, but rather a set of alternative stable states for a given ecosystem. What factors would influence the nature of the climax community? The specific species, the magnitude size of those species, the density of those species, how many individuals per square kilometer are there, the soil, the local climate, and more. While I have emphasized the temperate, deciduous forest biome as the ecosystem undergoes succession, remember that there are very different ecosystems across the globe, and they all undergo succession. In equatorial regions where we find rainforest ecosystems, insolation, temperature, and water availability would influence the nature of the climax communities. In the taiga biome of northern Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia, the system is dominated by conifers, trees bearing cones, such as pines, spruces, and firs. Temperature, water, and light availability influence the nature of the climax community. So for the record, to provide a list of all the factors that might influence the nature of climax communities, here it is. Water availability, temperature, exposure to sunlight, soil nutrients, slope and exposure to wind, frequency of disturbance, and random events such as dramatic weather. Remember that there is no one climax community, but rather a set of alternative stable states for a given ecosystem. Hopefully with this image, you can strengthen your understanding that no one climax community exists, but rather there are a set of alternative stable states for given ecosystems, and that you should be clear that water availability is an important abiotic factor that influences the nature of the climax community. This is a desert biome. Temperature and light availability, insolation, influence the nature of climax communities. This is the taiga biome in polar regions such as northern Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia. In the winter, light levels and temperatures are low. Local soil conditions, depth and nutrient level, and the particle type, sand or clay by way of example, all influence the nature of climax communities. Now it's important that you understand that if any of the abiotic factors I've described here were to change, this could lead to alternative stable states in an ecosystem. Slope angle and exposure to wind influence the nature of climax communities. In this single ecosystem, we can see one side of the valley to be forested, while the other side is not. This difference within a distance measured in meters results from the exposure to light and wind. Light and wind influence the nature of the climax community. With direct exposure to the sun, this side of the valley is also more dry. Again, notice the different communities in very close proximity, here and here. The more exposed region has fewer trees than the protected canyon. Slope and exposure to wind influence the nature of climax communities. This is a photograph of sand dune succession. Succession occurs here in a series known as a samosphere, an ecological succession process that was initiated with life on newly exposed coastal sand. Again, soil, slope, exposure to wind, or salt would influence the nature of the climax community in sand dunes. In this photograph, we can see the occurrence of fire on the savanna. The frequency of disturbance, such as fire, influences the nature of climax communities. Is fire a regular occurrence or is it infrequent? Has the occurrence of fire been regulated or managed by people? Any change in any abiotic factor could lead to an alternative stable state. You need to be able to discuss the factors which could lead to alternative stable states in an ecosystem. Succession also occurs within a shallow pond ecosystem that progressively fills in over time, becoming a meadow. As the shallow pond becomes more shallow, more and more plants can grow from the bottom. More plants catch more sediment, and the pond becomes more shallow, filled in by more sediment, and the area goes from marsh to meadow. The succession described here is known as a hydrosphere. A hydrosphere starts with a shallow pond that accumulates sediments from which various species of pond plants grow at the edges, accelerating the accumulation of more sediments. The shallow pond community gives way to the marsh community that ultimately gives way to a meadow community. Consider carefully the dramatically different communities from pond to meadow, including the consumer community, from fishes and amphibians to antelopes and coyote. In this photograph of a meadow, imagine that a small pond was once here. Eventually, a climax forest will move in. If the hydrosphere interests you, study the detail in this slide and the next. As you can see, a pond that begins to accumulate sediments, accelerating the accumulation of more sediments as more and more plants creep in from the edges. Eventually, the system changes. The small pond gives way to a marsh, which gives way to a meadow. People are frequently responsible for the disturbance that takes a community back to the first stages of succession. In fact, people will often cut forests or prairies to make way for agriculture. Then, with regular plowing, a process that disturbs the land, succession is initiated at regular intervals. And it's important to note that people purposefully grow species that would be called pioneer species in nature. People grow grasses such as wheat and rice and corn. Grasses are pioneer species with high net primary productivity. Regular plowing maintains the system in the early stages of succession for the purposes of high productivity. Here is a rice paddy maintained in early succession by regular plowing, whether by machine or animal. The crops people grow are often pioneer species, species that thrive in early successional stages. Also consider how the agricultural community is further influenced by people when they use herbicides or pesticides to eliminate certain species. How diverse are agricultural communities? Hopefully, from everything I've mentioned, you can explain how human activity can divert the progression of succession to an alternative stable state by modifying the ecosystem. Humans use and suppress fire in the management of a system. People employ agriculture and use plowing or grazing to change the progression of succession. As well, deforestation occurs, further changing the progression of succession and altering the system to an alternative stable state. With agriculture managed by people, the climax stage is rarely reached. The regularity of disturbance influences the nature of the community. As we come to the end of this movie, there is one more term I would like to introduce, and that term is zonation. The IB syllabus statement is distinguish succession, a temporal phenomenon, from zonation, a spatial phenomenon. Define zonation And zonation is change in the community along an environmental gradient across space due to factors such as changes in altitude, latitude, tidal level, or distance from shore. Zonation refers to changes in community across space, say from here to there, over there, while succession refers to change in a community in a single location over time. Zonation is change in the community along an environmental gradient due to latitude. Equatorial regions are warm with high sunlight and high rainfall, while polar regions are cold and dry with low levels of light. Equatorial rainforests are here. The world's great deserts are here. And tundra, here. A change in the community across space. Zonation refers to changes in the community along an environmental gradient due to a factor such as latitude. Zonation, change in the community along an environmental gradient due to altitude. Altitude means changing elevation with respect to sea, meters above sea level. Most often, regions near to the sea level are warm and wet, while higher elevations are cold with water held as ice. At lower elevations, subtropical forests can exist, while near the mountaintop, tundra exists. A change in the community across space. Zonation refers to changes in the community along an environmental gradient, such as altitude. The environmental gradient of tidal level results in zonation. Exposure to wave and water results in zonation. From deep water to shallow, from high wave exposure to low, the community changes spatially due to the environmental gradient of wave action and water coverage. The species composition changes spatially due to the tidal level. The environmental gradient related to distance from water results in zonation. Regions near the sea will be wetter, while those further will be more dry. Regions near the ocean will have higher exposure to salt, while those further away, less exposure to salt. Different communities will thrive here, while other communities will thrive there. This is zonation, a change in community along an environmental gradient such as distance from water. In this photograph, we can see zonation and succession. Zonation can be seen from the road to the interior of the forest, a change in the community across space. Zonation is a spatial phenomenon. Succession can be imagined in this location, where there are clearly early successional species due to the people who manage the road. Over here, in this location, we can see a climax community. Succession is a change in community over time in a single location. Succession is a temporal phenomenon. Succession requires time. Zonation is the patterning of communities across space. We can see zonation in this photograph from the field to the forest, patterning across space. Succession is a patterning of communities across time. In this location, we can see pioneer species maintained by the regular disturbance caused by people. In this image of a small pond, we can see zonation from here to here to here, a patterning of communities in distinct bands across a distance, space. Succession is patterning of communities in a single location through time. And that brings us to the end of Ecosystems and Ecology 2, Part 4. Part 5 will provide more detail on succession.